I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, and where you went to school. A little bit of your background that we don't usually hear in interviews.
Oh, I'd be glad to. I was born and grew up in the middle of the country in Nebraska. My parents were both school teachers. They both really liked teaching sciences. My father taught the physics and the chemistry and the biology in high school, and was also the principal of the high school. It was a small school, class sizes about 12, and it was a very good place to begin an education. My father let me play in the physics and chemistry and biology laboratories, so I enjoyed doing lots of things, making little motors that would run, making barometers out of mercury, playing with mercury. Could do that in those days.
Hopefully you didn't hold it in your hand.
Oh yes, I held it in my hands. So I'm still here at 80. I guess the most important things that I learned in school were how to type, how to touch type. That's been very valuable now that computers have come along. I also was taught in the 9th grade how to study by myself. That was the grade where students were introduced to algebra, and most of the farmers' sons in the area didn't really care much about learning algebra, and they didn't have much need of that in their work. So the math teacher gave me a book, and I and 2 or 3 other students went off in the corner and worked the problems in the book and learned algebra for ourselves. And this was such a wonderful way of learning that after I finished the algebra course, I got a calculus book and spent the next few years learning calculus by myself. I never really graduated from high school. I just stopped going there. This was in 1944, and instead I took an exam for the Navy and enlisted as a radar repairman, and essentially fell in love with electronics at that time. I did find out that the 2 schools that the teachers in Seattle recommended for learning physics were Caltech and MIT, and since Marjorie was living in California and going to Stanford, I chose Caltech, and that was a very lucky as well as wise choice, because I thought the undergraduate education I got at Caltech was superb. Even though I graduated from Caltech in electrical and mechanical engineering, when I got out of Caltech, I didn't know how to build a simple audio amplifier. But at MIT, I learned how to build complicated computer circuits out of the rudimentary operational amplifiers that were around at that time. Another great stroke of luck came when I was refused employment at the 3M company after they had offered me a job as a result of a back injury that I had. So that instead of going to Minneapolis, which I favored since my family still lived in Nebraska, I instead went to Bell Telephone Laboratories, and I went into the audio research department to study new ways and better ways of compressing and encoding speech so it could be transmitted over a very limited channel capacity wires and radio that were available in those days. I also was very lucky in that I had a boss who was both very smart and very famous and very lucky and very powerful. His name was John Pierce. He's best known for the invention of or the promulgation of communication satellites. Anyhow, Pierce was very interested in music. He was interested in information theory. How much information is there in speech? Which is a good question on how to compress speech. And how much information is there in music? And and he himself played the piano and liked to compose pieces. So he invited me to many concerts, and we went together. And then one of these, a local pianist, played some Schoenberg, which was very good, we thought, and some Schnabel, which we really detested. And in the intermission, John suggested to me that perhaps the computer could do better than this, and I should, since I had the equipment to convert computer digitized tapes into sound, I could write a program to perform music on the computer.
It seems to me that you really got into the research in computer music after that particular concert where you saw and heard Schoenberg with
Right.
John Pierce. Is that pretty much the turning point or that opportunity that came?
Well, that was the actual provocation for my writing Pt1. Now, if we hadn't gone to the concert, I think I would have written some music programs anyhow, because I was very interested in this. And my interest came from two things. One is that although I've always loved to play the violin, and I have had an amateur string quartet going most of my life, I was never very good at it, and so I wanted to be able to make better music that didn't require such manual dexterity as almost all instruments require. And also I felt that there were many composers who would compose a piece for an orchestra, and then they might never hear the piece, or might be delayed for years. And so that this would provide a way for composers to write something and hear it almost immediately.
Was there anyone else doing this sort of thing anywhere in the U.S. or around the world?
There were a lot of people who wanted to get music out of computers. Mm-hmm. And in Australia there was a significant effort, and there were some people in the United States who could get printers to produce pitches, and they would then write a little program to play Mary Had a Little Lamb or something like that with the printer sound. But I certainly think that my program was one of the earliest ones that would actually generate arbitrary sound waveforms. Essentially, the sampling theorem shows that there are really no limits to the sounds you can make from samples, that any sound the human ear can hear you can make with the right number and accuracy and combination of samples, so that the computer is a universal musical instrument. And other instruments, the violin in particular, they're beautiful and lovable, but they always sound like violins, or at least it's very difficult to make them sound not like a violin. And I think the sampling theorem is true, but I now think there is a corollary to it, and that is that of all the classes of sounds you can make from sampled a sequence of samples, most of them are not musically interesting, and plenty of them are unpleasant, and some of them are even dangerous. And if you're trying to make music, there's a psychological tendency to make sounds that are dangerously loud, and I myself feel that the temptation to the composer is that he has made a timbre that doesn't satisfy what he wanted to say, and so he hopes that by making the sound louder it will have the kind of power that he really feels in his head. So that's led to well, it's led to earplugs, and should lead to the use of wider use of sound level meters and things like that. We need better understanding of the physical correlates of beautiful sounds. Beautiful as judged by the ear and the cortex of the listener. And computers have contributed to our understanding of what computers in the hands of the right people. Two of the right people were Jean-Claude Risset and John Chowning. Now, I wrote a number of papers describing Music 3. The fundamental paper was published in the Bell System Technical Journal, but the paper that had the most important impact, in my opinion, was a paper I published in what's called Science magazine. And the reason it was so important was that Risset in Paris, who was studying actually for a doctor's degree in physics at the University of Paris, and John Chowning, who was at Stanford, also studying for his musical doctorate degree, read the paper and saw the potential in this and were interested in it. And Risset persuaded his thesis professor to send him to Bell Labs to work with me, and he ended up working a couple of years in two separate, or more than 2 years, in two separate sections, discovering some of the fundamentals of timbre for traditional instruments. John Chowning both read and understood the paper, came back essentially for a day's visit to Bell Labs, and we talked more about it, and he returned to Stanford and wrote his own computer programs. Risset and Chowning together made enormous advances in the production of beautiful music. Now, what was Risset's contribution? And at that time, people realized that the spectrum of sounds, rather than the time waveform of sounds was a better way of characterizing